All right, so thank you everyone for coming out tonight on a kind of a cold and drizzly Thursday night. It's really a pleasure to be talking about this topic. When Sam asked me to talk about this, she said, talk about the future of legal practice, and we've got lots of different constituents and stakeholders in the audience. And I said, great. I didn't tell her that I was going to talk about the death of the legal profession at the end, right? Because it's always fun to sort of have, a death at the end of the talk. So this talk, I'm going to try to include everything, so there's a lot of stuff about artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's a little bit about Adam Smith. That's always fun for the economics geeks here. A lot about technology and the way that globalization is changing things, and then a death at the end. Okay, so you're warned. Don't be too frightened, but we'll get there towards maybe in 30 minutes time or so. Lots of time for questions. I really want to hear what people have to say about this topic. But the idea behind this talk is to sort of start to map out a few of the sort of the large-scale global changes that are happening with legal practice. And this comes about as a consequence of two things. I don't really like talking about myself very much. Actually, no, of course I do. But I don't really like talking about myself too much, but it's actually kind of valuable this time because there are sort of two features of me and my kind of background that kind of leads to this talk. So the first is, I did computer science and law back when that was really not interesting. The reason I was doing it was because I was really interested in artificial intelligence back when artificial intelligence was really not interesting. And my first academic works were in artificial intelligence and law back at the time when that was just the dumbest thing that anyone had ever heard of, right? Like nobody was interested in artificial intelligence, and to add artificial intelligence to law, it was like, honestly, it was, I can't even tell you, it was like, the law of mushrooms or something. It was so arcane, not interesting, nobody cared about it. And I went, oh, okay, and sort of shelved it for a little while when I was in the States, because there was this period for what was called the second artificial intelligence winter, and no one wanted to do anything about that. And then now, of course, everybody's excited about artificial intelligence, and almost no one knows what it's about, what's actually going on. So I'm going to teach you what artificial intelligence is about when we talk about it these days. It takes literally one slide, so it's all good. All right, you'll actually, it won't hurt a bit. It will slip down really easily. So that's sort of the background that I come to. But the thing about this, well, what is the future of law and legal practice and the legal profession, comes about as a consequence that I was asked to start a law school in Australia. And the law school that I was asked to start was at a small, nothing university, nothing like King's, had no reputation. It was a technology university. It was the least interesting university in Melbourne. There were already 7 other law schools in Melbourne. No one was asking for more law grads. And they said, we want to start a law school. And I went, great idea. Let me go and do something else. And they said, no. We really want you to think about what would be a good reason to start a law school today. And I said, well, obviously you're talking to me because of my technology background. And they sort of went, oh, it's all about IP and you've done IP. And I went, yeah, but there's got to be something more. There's got to be some reason why a new law school should exist. And they said, well, we trust you to find that out. I went, okay, fine. So I went out and I spoke to just everyone I could speak to in the course of the 5 years that I was that founding dean. And I had 103 meetings in the first year and about the same number the next year and every year thereafter. And it wasn't meetings within the college or within the university. It was meetings with the profession, with a bar, with a bench, with legal tech providers, with this group of people that are called alternative legal service providers. How many people in the room know what an ALSP is? Okay, great. 2 out of 100. That's good. You're going to know a lot more about ALSPs by the end of this. And I had no idea what the hell these things were. And I went, wow, okay, that's really interesting. There are sort of some changes that are different from when I started as a lawyer 1,000 years before, right? So what would we need in order to create a new type of lawyer that would be able to compete in that market? Because one of the amazing things about starting a law school is you've got no grads, you've got no alumni, you've got no brand, so you'd better actually start to understand what the market needs. So I just spent the whole time working out what is the new set of skills and what does the market need. Now, I'm sure I was wrong in all sorts of ways, but this paper, this talk, the 4 things I'm going to talk about today are sort of the large-scale global changes that existed in Australia, existed in America when I go and talk over there, certainly exist here and especially in the city and the way in which commercial law is done. So that's the sort of the framework, that's the starting point around what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to present to you. And I'll try to do it really quickly so you can ask questions. All right, so what's the future of law? All right, so there are 4 things I'm going to talk about, but before I talk about that, I want to talk about the stuff that I've struck through up the top. Right, so the first time I did this, I said, well, this is the future of the legal profession. And then I went, the future of the legal profession, there isn't going to be a legal profession as we recognize it now. That's the death at the end, okay? Foreshadowing. So then I went, okay, it's about the future of legal practice. That's absolutely true, right? So it's legal practice, but it's not the way in which we've always seen legal practice, which is focusing on what do lawyers do, right? And so I went, well, rather than thinking about that, let's flip it. And if there's one thing that I would sort of ask you to take away from tonight's presentation, is the idea of flipping it, rather than focusing upon the lawyers who are engaged in practice, who are members of a profession. Instead, think about it from the point of view of the consumer, of the legal services that are being delivered to them. Because if you start thinking about the nature of the legal services that they need, which by and large we as lawyers do not provide to them, and we as law schools do not teach our graduates to provide to them because it's too expensive to do that, then you start to get an idea about the reason why things are changing. It's about what's happening at the service delivery end, not so much at the end of, oh, I'm a member of a learned profession, or I'm at a law firm and I am engaged in legal practice. That these things are not incommensurate. They are not mutually exclusive, but they are different. So that's the sort of the framework that I'm starting from. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to try to do it really quickly. I can talk much faster than this, but hopefully this is around about the kind of speed. And it's just, these are 4 really, really simple observations. I got to say, this is not, brain surgery, right? Like, this is not complicated. I hope by the end that you'll say, actually, yeah, that seems reasonable. What do I do about that? And what I'm going to do in relation to each of these observations is try to give you the idea of, well, how is this going to affect different sorts of stakeholders, wherever you come from, whether you're a student, whether you're an academic within the law school or a law school, whether you're a practitioner, whether you are a person who is actually dealing with a service delivery need, a legal need. I hope you'll start to understand that these changes will affect you. Sometimes a lot, sometimes not very much. So we're going to talk about commodification and virtualization first. So these 2 things are happening right now. They've already happened. If you haven't noticed them, it's because you haven't been dealing with this sort of stuff out there. If you go and talk to people out there, you'll see that these things exist already. The 3rd and the 4th thing, the death of the law firm, another death, and AI and law, is stuff that you can see right now if you look, but it's not really clear how it's going to play out. So I'm going to make some predictions around that. The first 2, I don't need to make predictions because they're already there. Right, so this is the present reality, these first 2 things. First one is commodification, second is virtualization. So commodification is just a really obvious thing. Richard Susskind's been talking about it forever. Lots of other people have sort of mentioned this, but we're finally starting, I think, to see it done at scale. And that's the observation of, think about the clothes that you are wearing right now. How many people here went to Savile Row and had them handmade for you? Okay, right. Point taken. Right, Savile Row still exists. You can go and get a bespoke suit there. You can fly to Paris and get a beautifully made, handmade bespoke shirt from Charvet, but it costs hundreds of pounds, and for a bespoke suit, thousands of pounds, right? Most people don't do that. There's, of course, a small number of people that do that because they have the disposable income to be able to do it, but none of us here are wearing bespoke clothes, right? We have socks that are computer knitted. We have jackets which have been cut by laser using a computer generated or a computer controlled CNC mill, essentially, right? It just cuts it. And then they might be stitched together by hand, sort of, but they're almost certainly done in Indonesia or Malaysia. They're probably not done here, right? And the reason that I know that is that I can afford it. Right? It's literally that simple. If I can afford it, then it's been made somewhere else, and it's probably been made at scale in a factory using the processes that we all understand from as far back as Henry Ford, and now we sort of add the globalization aspect on top of it. We'll see that soon. So that idea of law, and lots of other services, by the way. Moving from a bespoke model to a commoditized model is pretty obvious, right? We see it in the products we make. Do we see it within the service delivery within law? And a few years ago, I would have said, no, that's not the case. But these days you do. You don't have to look very hard. These are 4 examples. Legal Vision is from Australia. It does essentially, really simple, company contracts that you can just purchase off the shelf, and that's really easy. Direct Legal is somewhat similar here in the UK. LegalZoom does the same thing in the US. Settle Easy is the startup that I created 6 years ago when I was dean at Swinburne. I had this idea for a long time. I said, in the conveyance of property, it seems to me that it would be really straightforward to communicate with the client by SMS and have a back-end workflow that just sort of steps you through the process of conveyancing. That means that conveyancers don't have to have a paper file, and that they can do it on their by computer on their dining table. And we can just parcel that work out as piecework. And we pay them based upon the fact that they've done the search that's necessary. It comes back, and I can see it as the manager of this business that, this particular conveyance is going really well. And, I went around to a lot of lawyers and said, why don't we do this? And they said, oh, there's no way that you would do that. That's a really bad idea. We've got a whole lot of problems with, professional indemnity insurance. How could you do that by computer? I said, I'm not doing it by computer. I'm doing it by people. I've just got process engineering around it. And they said, well, as a lawyer, I'm really worried about your indemnity insurance. And I said, as a process engineer and as an AI guy, I'm really worried that you think quality assurance is hire someone and hope they don't have a bad day. So I finally found the right people to do this. And if one deal goes right next week, we will be the largest conveyancer in Australia. We don't have a shop front. Everything is done by SMS. We've got a dashboard, all the usual sort of stuff, right? So if I can create that, and even if we get it wrong, it doesn't matter, because if I can create that, other people can create that. So the idea is that commodification, right, is going to take place. And the reason that commodification of legal services is going to take place in a small band, not every legal service, right? Just certain ones like conveyancing, family law, low-scale criminal stuff, probate, all of the standard high street kind of stuff. The reason that's going to take place are these 2 things, right? This is a really simple decision tree from a paper that was written in 1973. Decision tree is just a way of representing rules, right? This is for criminal law one. Did the prosecution request conditional bail or oppose bail? No. Did previous court impose conditions of remand? No. Did police impose conditions of remand in custody? No. Then grant bail, right? It's just a really, really simple way of representing a set of rules. That is the sort of stuff that I was interested in. It was called expert systems. I was interested when I was doing AI and law 30 years ago. That was standard technology. It's really, really simple to represent law in a way that's computationally tractable, okay? So that, combined with the thing on the left-hand side, right, which is just the cocktail napkin of entrepreneurship, which is basically there's lots of VC money out there that's chasing this. Less so, today after various problems, including the crypto meltdown at FTX and BlockFi. I hope none of you had any money in BlockFi. We're not going to be talking about blockchain, by the way. Happy to talk about it, but not today. So all of this is pushing towards, at a certain end of the market, the low end of the market, the high street end of the market, commodification is really straightforward. And there's lots of really, really good reasons to do this. And the reasons are all expressed in pound signs, right? The people that are behind this want to make a lot of money. And what they want to do is they want to take as much of the market as they possibly can. Now, there are lots of systemic reasons why it sort of takes a while to do that, but eventually it's going to happen. And what that means, I've got, I've done 3 legal tech and reg tech startups so far, and all of them, I don't focus on selling legal tech to law firms, right? I focus on disrupting the legal service delivery so that we are delivering to the market directly rather than the law firms delivering it to the market. That's not because I'm a bad guy. It's just because I think that's where the money is, right? So the mechanism here is that the process of commodification is going to mean certain parts of legal practice is going to get stripped away. So what are those parts of legal practice? It's things like conveyancing, it's things like probate, it's things like low-end family disputes, criminal matters, and so forth. So that's all high street firm stuff, okay? And so the problem with that is that, if you're a high street lawyer, the market starts to look a little different. It's harder to make enough money because there are competitors out there who can undercut you. And it's no longer enough just to open up, a shop front and say on the high street, hey, I'm a solicitor, I'm going to do this. So that has a really significant effect upon the ability of high street firms to operate, both now and in the future, right? For barristers, it doesn't really matter at all. Any barristers in the room, you guys are safe. We can talk about that in the question and answer. For the mid-sized firms, it really depends on which part of the market you're operating in. There are lots of areas that mid-sized firms operate in which are relatively commoditizable, okay? So if you're sort of thinking about, there are large practice groups that do, leasehold things, which is really just cookie cutter stuff. There are lots of things which are insurance claims and those sorts of areas. They are easily commoditizable. Now, whether those firms decide to actually commoditize that internally, right, and have the practice groups be partly, computer-based and partly lawyer-based is entirely up to them. And there are lots of really smart people that work in law firms, and they'll get that right. So the question there is, well, it depends. Is that going to affect the mid-size, the mid-tiers? Yeah, maybe, but probably not as much as they might worry about. The large firms not very serious, because the large firms are all bet the company problems, right? Or really huge scale litigation, depending on the nature of the firm. And that is not really commoditizable, right? That's complex legal. There will always be a place for that. Whether those firms continue to grow at the rate that they have grown is an open question, which we can take up in the Q&A. For students and graduates, it's really very serious. And the reason for that, the reason that I suggest that, is that there is always a group of grads that want to go out there and open their own firm. It's a great pathway. As long as they can get the necessary support, they will be able to learn on the job. They'll be able to have a living within this particular environment, and having a relatively small scale practice in a high street firm is very nice. It's a great place to learn in many cases, and then they can take over the practice and so on and so forth. With fewer of those practices, that then changes the nature of graduate opportunities pretty significantly. Now, that may not be the case for King's grads, and I think that's probably true, right? But it is the case for grads of a large range of our competitors who are, notionally lower down in the food chain, okay? Because those grads all of a sudden have fewer opportunities, which means they ask themselves, should I really go to law school? And so on and so forth, okay? So that change is one which we can already see happening, but has some pretty serious impacts upon the students and the grads, and then as a consequence also the law firms. Okay, so that's one kind of thing we've already seen, commodification. The second thing is what I'll call virtualization, but it's also managed services and legal ops. Managed services and legal ops, I don't know if many of you have heard about this. If you work within corporate legal, you would have heard of the terms. They're essentially flip side of each other. Legal ops is the way in which legal operations is what it's short for. And the idea here is there's certain types of work that rather than getting lawyers to do it, we either initially offshore it or we stick it in a team that is relatively lowly paid in what is often a captive ALSP to actually do that kind of work rather than getting the very highly paid lawyers to do it. So I'll give you a really simple example that actually came from my time working in America. So I was at New York Law School. We were, so it was in New York, right, obviously. We were charging $55,000 US a year for our JD, times 3, right? As my dean at the time said, every single student that walked into the place was driving Mercedes-Benz off a cliff every year for 3 years. And at the end of it, they had a debt without even having a house to show for it. All they had was the possibility, maybe, that they could make enough money to service that debt, right? So none of them, unless they were supported by family, walked away with less than $200,000 worth of debt. Okay, so how do you service that kind of debt? If you're really good, and a whole lot of my students were really fantastic, we got them jobs in white shoe law firms like Sherman Sterling or Cadwalader or a range of other ones, Debevoise. And a lot of them were doing litigation support, or they were in the litigation team. And their job, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, was to sit in a basement and review documents for litigation. Because, of course, as anyone who's in litigation knows, the process of litigation requires you to disclose to the other side all of those documents which are relevant to the dispute, right? That's part of the way in which adversarial litigation takes place, at least within the common law and certainly within America. And so every single one of the documents that came out, and there were millions of documents, right, had to be reviewed. And at the time, we were just at that transition point from moving from human to computer review. But at the time of human review, you know, they would just sit in the basement, they would just review document after document after document. They'd do it for 12 hours a day. If they were lucky, they would get a coffee break. If they were very lucky, they'd be given 40 minutes for a lunch. But in exchange for that horrible existence, they were paid $160,000 US a year, which meant they could service their debt. So they did it for about 4 or 5 years, and then they went and did something else, and just went, my God, I nearly died, right? But these days, the way in which you do that is partly technological, but then partly through a managed service or legal ops, a legal operations team, which is to say that using the beauty of the internet, you can upload all of the documents into a cloud service, a cloud bucket, and then have a team in India or Bangladesh or South Africa look at those documents, right, and assess them for relevance. Of course, you've got the computer running in the background doing a lot of this sort of work, but for that sort of stuff, or for contract review in a big due diligence for a merger and acquisition deal, right, where you're having to look at every single contract that the company has, then you just offshore it, right? You send it off to what's called an ALSP these days, an alternative legal service provider. You might have a captive ALSP within your firm doing this, but none of the people within any of those firms, although they are legally trained, they're not being paid to do work at the level that we sort of think of as legal work. This is sort of like what we often sort of characterize as paralegal work. So it's cheaper, right? So they'll do it in conjunction with computers, right? You will find in these ALSPs that you might have 500 legally trained people, but only one person who's characterized as the attorney or the lawyer of record, right? Being paid as a normal lawyer, right? In the sense of, what we think of as a city wage here. The rest of them are, characterized perhaps as legal technologists. Legal analysts is often another term, but they're not lawyers. They're not operating as lawyers in the usual sense. What that does, and this, as you see, there's a whole industry around this kind of thing. So what that does is it creates a different marketplace for law grads, right? It creates a different environment for law firms, right? So the environment, when you think about for small firms, probably not affected, because the thing about these ALSPs and the thing about virtualization is that it has to be a sufficient scale for it to work, right? You've got to have lots and lots of things. The canonical example is e-discovery, right? Or technology-assisted review, as it's sometimes called, right? Small law firms don't have that kind of thing. So probably small law firms not really affected. Again, mid-sized firms start to have a problem in this area if they're exposed to these sorts of cases or these sorts of issues, because all of a sudden the ALSPs start to take over that particular part of the market that the mid-tiers otherwise would have been pitching for. And I didn't think that in my first version of this, or the last version of this that I gave, I said mid-sized firms not serious. Mid-sized firms are not affected at all. But I went to a presentation by one of the big ALSPs the other day. It's called Factor. Anyone here know Factor? So the guy who's the lead, the chief strategist, is a genius. And he has basically worked out, or he's created a situation in Factor where they say, we do the bottom end of the market, high volume, low risk. But actually what we really want to do is we want to move into the mid part of the corporate environment. So that is where you are a trusted advisor to the business, as well as understanding the law enough, as well as being able to do stuff at scale. And that particular part of the market, it's a very valuable part of the market. And it's the area where mid-sized firms typically used to work. And so that actually, and Factor is very well capitalized. They're a company, they're not a partnership. They've got lots of money. that's been given to them by private equity or invested in them by private equity. So all of a sudden, you've got a very different sort of competitor in that particular space. And that's something which has only come about within the last 6 months. So I think what's happened is that the ALSPs have moved from being sort of like the bottom end of the market into the middle part of the market, and that has some serious implications for mid-tier firms. Large firms, probably not very serious, because actually what's happened with large firms is that many of them have created their own internal ALSP. They're called captive ALSPs. So what they do is they say, what we're going to do is we're actually going to create that type of high volume, low risk legal analyst looking at these things, not paying them very much money, and we are going to shove that into that part of the business. We're going to make money from that. So people here probably know, the Silver Circle firm Ashurst. So they've had Ashurst Advance for a long time. Allen & Overy have got a group there in Australia. There are lots of firms that have done this. DWF up in Manchester, which is a regional firm with aspirations nationally, has got a really, really solid practice with this. And basically the way in which you can tell that they've got a captive ALSP, you can look for two things. Do they have a warehouse in the bad part of town where they put people who are legally trained but they don't call lawyers, and you pay them very little money, right? And if you think to take Ashurst Advance as an example, Ashurst has got some really gorgeous offices over by Liverpool Street, okay? But they've got some not so nice offices, but perfectly okay offices. I mean, they conform with all the occupational health and safety requirements. There is some light as long as, as you look in a certain direction, up in Glasgow, right? And they've got this operation up in Glasgow that does all of this sort of, I don't want to say legal scut work, but, work that is lower paid at volume up there in Glasgow because it's a cheap location to do it. There are lots of good, well-trained lawyers who want to stay in Glasgow, and it's relatively cheap to live up there, so they're happy to stay near home. And so they will work there at a much lower rate than they would work in Liverpool Street. And exactly the same operation exists in Ashurst in Brisbane. Again, so my last gig was in Brisbane, and I got to know them really quite well. And they chose Brisbane because it's not Melbourne or Sydney, which is expensive. And there's lots and lots of really well-trained lawyers, right, who will live in Brisbane at lower cost and be paid this way. So you see this sort of operation taking place in all sorts of parts of the market. Large firms are not really going to be affected too much by this, because either they're super high-end bet the farm litigation or bet the farm transactions, bet the company transactions, or alternatively, they've got their own captive ALSP, so they don't care. Students and graduates, it's really serious, because what it does is it changes the nature of the jobs that you can expect at the end. It's not to say you won't be employed, but it is to say that the nature of the work that you think you're going to be doing might be very different from the work that you actually end up doing. You think you're going to be going in and doing high-end M&A work, but in fact, you end up doing low-end mergers and acquisition due diligence, looking at lots and lots of contracts using technological review mechanisms. That's a bit of a problem, right? What it also means, and this is really interesting, when you talk to the big law firms, they just crow about how amazing the market is, how incredibly well they've done. But it's interesting, I have not talked to many that say, actually, we're going to increase the number of grad positions or training positions that we have. Even as they grow, even as they make more money, they say, actually, we're going to keep that pretty flat. We're going to take the same number of grads that we took 20 years ago. So I started my career at what is now Herbert Smith Freehills, and in Melbourne, we had 26 trainee lawyers going in there. There hasn't been a year in the last 10 years where the Melbourne office of Herbert Smith Freehills has taken more than 20, right? And that's not because they haven't grown. They now make much more money than they used to make, right? And they're much larger than they were when I started 30 years ago, but they haven't grown in terms of their trainees. And that's because they're actually more efficient. Efficiency feels like it's good, but it's not if it means that you're not getting a job. So the implications for grads is pretty significant. For ALSPs itself, it depends. There's a whole story that I can tell about ALSPs, but I'm not going to bore you with that now because we're already over time. Instead, we're going to talk about the death of the law firm, another death foretold Okay, so this one's really simple. It's not really a death. It's more just sort of a decentering. Let's call it that. So I love stock photography. The one on the left-hand side is a stock photography, which is what I think of when I think of a law firm, back when I worked in a big corporate law firm. So that's the law firm. And that bust there is from the University of Glasgow, I think. It's Adam Smith, right? The author of The Wealth of Nations, the guy who essentially created modern economics. Okay, so Smith was working at the beginning of, actually the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, when he wrote the Wealth of Nations, and he wrote around a whole lot of stuff around the national economic environment. But there was one thing which was picked up by a range of economists subsequently, which nowadays is called the theory of the firm. And so what Smith said, as he was looking around and seeing the way that we moved from the artisanal age into the industrial age, was specialization. And specialization was driven by the fact that because we now had steam and steam power and water power from mills and various things, you think of all of the Midlands and the huge successes of that era, of that period for that part of England. It was driven by this new type of power that meant we could create factories that would do things that were impossible just a few years before. So a few years before Smith was writing, the way in which you would build a chair or weave cloth or anything like that would be that there would be an artisan who would be doing all of this through hand power in some way and be crafting a chair, let's say, right? So they'd have to individually shave the legs using spoke shaves and draw knives. They would then turn it and do all that sort of stuff. And after an extensive period, like a really, really long period, if you commissioned an artisan to do this, like Chippendale or something like that, after a year's worth of work, you would get a table setting. And so only the gentry and royalty actually had the money to be able to do that. It was the version of bespoke tailoring, but multiplied tenfold. And so that was the artisanal period. But of course, what happened when we had steam power and factories and so on, you could actually turn the legs using a steam-powered lathe or a water-powered lathe. You could create the cloth using a water-powered mill, and so on and so forth, right? So what that meant was that you could produce much, much more. As soon as you were producing much, much more, two things happened. You had to have people who were specialized to produce that. They were just turning out legs. They weren't turning out chairs, right? Or they were just creating the fabric. They weren't doing the whole thing, right? Once you had specialization, you had 5 people doing this or 10 people doing this, you needed a way of coordinating that behavior, right? Because it's no good if you've got 25 chair legs and no chair backs. You have to have them all put together. Someone's got to be putting them together. Someone's got to be saying, hey, this thing only works if you've got the requisite numbers. So what that led to was the development of the firm, right? A mechanism of management, right? We are in the building that houses the King's Business School. The discipline of management came about as a consequence literally of that particular observation, right? That we are trying to coordinate things so that specialists can do stuff and then end up producing things that are valuable, right? But we have to coordinate it. Hence the law firm. If you think about a law firm, you've got lots and lots of different people at different levels. You've got what's often called the finders, minders, binders, and grinders, right? The top level, you've got the partner who deals with the client, whom the client trusts, right? You've got so they're the finder. The minder is the one who, a little bit lower down, is actually coordinating all of the sort of parts of all of the associates. You've got the binders, the senior associates who are actually doing a lot of the work. It's often the higher ends who are not doing that much work. And then you've got the grinders, right? The low end associates who are doing that. But someone's got to coordinate all of that. The only way you can do that is through the firm. The only way you can actually have billing is through the firm. You've got the back office that does that. There's an IT person who makes sure that the computers turn on and so on, right? You need a firm to do that. That was absolutely true up until a few years ago, right? There was essentially 2 ways in which you could coordinate activity in a commercial setting. You've either got the firm or you've got contracts, right? The whole law of contract is about mechanisms of non-firm interaction, right? Of ensuring the outcomes of these things. Then along comes the platform providers. right? And so now we actually have a brand new field of economics called platform economics, or sometimes called innovation economics, which looks at how can you coordinate the delivery of services and products without either the mechanism of the firm or the mechanism of contracts. Adam Smith was absolutely right up until he was, kind of jumped by Travis Kalanick, the guy who was behind Uber for many years. It's now Dara Khoroshevsky, of course. But the point about this was, up until a few years ago, the only way in which I could get home from this place tonight, assuming I didn't want to take a tube, was to go out there and hail a taxi. If I'm hailing a taxi, then I need to make sure that there is a communication function inside the taxi, that the taxi drivers are regulated and trained and all those sorts of things, right? These days, all I do is I've got an app. I go, okay, here's where I want to go. Press the button, and Uber or whoever turns up depending upon the particular market that you're in. That's brand new. Can we see this sort of platform approach within law? And the answer is yes. I can give you lots and lots of examples of them. There are ones out there that will capture a whole lot of freelancers, rate them for you. There are ones that actually will create, there are so many marketplaces for lawyers that it's just ridiculous. And so you can see already the beginning of a platform environment for the delivery of legal services. You don't need a firm in quite the way that you did. Or if you do, here is a really, really simple sort of on-ramp for all of the partners of law firms in this office, right? So at the moment, the way in which you have to staff for big legal commercial work is as follows. You take your best guess about what the next year is going to look like and you hire accordingly. Then when you have a huge spike, because there's a royal commission, there's an investigation, there's some huge piece of litigation that you didn't expect that you were going to get, you work those people to death, right? And then they leave, okay? And that's not a really good approach. And if you talk to any of the managing partners or any of the hiring partners in any of the firms, they go, this is the big problem, the great resignation, as it's called, also tied with what's wrong with the kids these days? They don't want to work, right? Millennials, oh my God, right? So here's a really simple way of fixing this, which they're already looking at. You staff for your standard level of service delivery, right? And then you contract with a flexible staffing environment that's got ratings for Dan's really, really good at computer-related stuff, right? And has delivered previously on this. And then when that work comes in, you hire Dan not as a lawyer, but as a freelancer, right? Or as a freelance lawyer, right? So what you end up with is a situation where we are going to end up with essentially the gig economy for lawyers, right? We're already there for a lot of this, but we can see exactly what this particular structure looks like over the next 10 to 20 years. So what does that mean for you all, depending on where you come from? For small law firms, not particularly a problem. It actually is sort of good for them because they don't have to have too many people on their books, and payroll is a big issue for small firms, for the high street firms. For the mid-size, it's pretty serious, and for large firms, maybe serious. And the reason that it affects different firms in a different way is if you are a corporate and you are looking to give work to a lawyer to just get that work done, right? You will end up with having two choices. You can give it to Dan, who's a really, really good organizer of these things and has got a platform technology behind him, right? Or you can give it to Michael, who's sitting in a law firm with all of the costs that are associated with that law firm, right? Which in the end, I have to pay. I was at Allen & Overy today, wonderful firm, really, really great place. And I used to walk into law firms and go, wow, this is really amazing. This is a great office. God, this is gorgeous. So much marble. And leather, my God, this smells so good. I never want to leave this chair. It's just beautiful to sit in. And then I sort of think of it from the perspective of the client, because the clients are paying for that, right? No matter how beautiful, in fact, the more beautiful the environment, the more money they're paying. Okay, so why wouldn't you, if you trust Dan to actually deliver this because he's done it in the past using this freelance structure and the platform, then he's done it at half the price because he doesn't have an office in Bishopsgate Square, right? Wouldn't you choose Dan? Now, there are lots of reasons to say, no, you're never going to do that, and I totally get it. But at the margins, we're going to start seeing those changes. We're already starting to see those changes because the corporates are very, very worried about the amount of money they spend on lawyers, right? They're constantly being squeezed by their CFO, right? The general counsel these days always reports to the CFO. They never have autonomy, right? And the CFO is always the bean counter who says, that costs too much money, make it less next year. And the lawyer or the GC says, I can't make it less next year, right? Because we've still got all of these problems that we've got to deal with that are legally significant risks for the business, right? I've got to find a way of actually reducing that, right? The only ways in which you can reduce that is to try to bring it in-house. Never a good solution long-term, right? Because you think it's going to cost us less than sending it out to these large law firms, or you start looking at alternative service delivery like freelancers. So mid-size are going to struggle with this particular idea. Large firms, we'll see. I think they'll be fine. At least for a while. They'll probably start doing it anyway. You're already starting to see this, right? You just outsource your IT services. You don't own that in-house if you're a law firm, right? You can do the same sort of thing with HR. You can do all of these functions, just kind of go, you know what, we'll use a platform just to provide that. And a lot of these law firms, which is fascinating, they take their failed lawyers, the ones that say, I don't want to do this anymore, right? I'm sick of the partnership track. I'm going to go off and do something else. And they keep them in a freelance environment. Right, so they actually have a legal staffing business. Pinsent Masons has got one in Australia. Cause have got one. I spoke to the managing partner, a good friend of mine at this law firm, and I said, "Oh, you should do all of these other things like ALSPs and all that stuff." He said, "Dan, we're making so much money from providing lawyers to our clients, by this flexible staffing arrangement. We don't know where to put all the money. We're not going to bother with this other stuff. It's just a waste of our time compared with the amount of money we make from legal staffing." So you're starting to see this sort of thing happening already. For lawyers and grads and law schools, it's really serious. And the reason it's serious is that we are graduating a group of students who should expect to have a significant part of their life in freelance work, right? That is so different from the way in which we have trained our lawyers to this point. If you are I have friends in design schools, right? So whether they're architects or graphic designers or whatever, and it's been the case that freelancing in those areas is really common. It's just super normal. So the grads sort of understand that they will spend part of their lives in that sort of environment, right? Which is quite precarious and quite unpleasant, right? Law students, I don't think we've really prepared them for that. We haven't really thought that through. So that's going to come as a deep shock to them, and it comes as a deep shock to the law schools. It comes as a deep shock to the law schools for two reasons. One is you are graduating these students that need these new set of skills that you haven't had to teach them before. That's the first one. The second one is if you are lower ranked than kings, you are graduating students who don't necessarily have the same route to partnership that they used to have. Because they're probably going to be within a freelance environment for a fairly significant period. They may never make it to the corner office. That changes the value of the law degree, which then changes how much you can charge for it. It changes how many people come, changes the economics of the law school. And I've seen that because I've worked at lower tier law schools than kings, right? And so it's a really significant and important structural aspect that law school deans need to worry about. Okay, so that's the death of the law school. Law firm, sorry. No, law school's never going to die. Law school's always going to survive, don't worry. My final observation, I have taken up too much time, so I'm going to do this really quickly, and I can do this really quickly, even though this is my special subject, right? I love this stuff more than well, not life itself, but I love this stuff just more than I can tell you. I've been doing artificial intelligence and law in various ways for more than 30 years, and I never expected for this thing to happen. Hang on, can I do this bit here? I was down here in the salt mines of standard rule-based reasoning through my first article in artificial intelligence was in 1992. That was sort of, as you can see, this period sort of here. There's a little bit of machine learning going on, not very much. Anyone who was doing it was kind of a bit of an idiot because nobody thought that was really the way forward. It was mostly about rules and symbolic systems, as they're called. And we were trying to say, can we take the rules of law and put them into a computer system and generate something useful? Spent a lot of time thinking about that and about, what is legal reasoning and blah, blah, blah. This slide shows you what happened right here, right? In 2009, 3 guys got together with their postdocs and changed the world, right? Like literally, there's, like 1/4 guy. So it's Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Josh Bengier. And they went, you know what? The technology is changing and the data sets are changing, and we think we can create No, I didn't show this. I've just done a different slide set. We can create things that are called deep learning systems. And the reason they're called deep learning is that up until that point, you would have these things called neural nets that were actually very shallow. And what they did is they just basically built them out much, much larger. So they had lots and lots of internal states. So that meant that they were more powerful. It also meant they were really harder to train. But if you had big data sets and fast computers, you could start to do it. And so what happened was essentially overnight, we went from that's a really bad area to work in to what we have these days, which is the deep learning world that we live in. When we talk about AI these days, we're talking about machine learning. We're talking about deep learning. There are a few different architectures and approaches, which I won't bore you with. But essentially what you've got is we take lots and lots of data, we run it through an architecture, we generate a model, and from that model, we predict the outcome of future events based on past events. Now, that's very similar to the way that we as human beings learn. There are certain things that are built into our brain structure. But, you know, we kind of learn that that thing over there is hot. I have a 10-month-old, and we have to sort of teach him that here's how you stand up, right? He hasn't got that yet, right? Here's how you don't cut yourself on the radiator or bits and pieces, right? And so the whole process of deep learning is very similar to that process of learning as a child. It's not perfect, and there's all sorts of reasons to say it's never going to end up being the thing that we think it's going to end up, but it's pretty significant. Now, what does that mean for law? Before we get onto that, the answer, because I've got, you know, there's like a cute reveal in relation to this. The cute reveal is AI in law is the least concerning thing of all of the stuff I've been talking about. All of the three things I've talked about before, you should worry about them. AI, don't worry about it, unless you want to be a long-haul trucker, an ophthalmologist or a radiographer, right? Because long-haul trucking is just self-driving cars with lots of money behind it. We're reasonably close to saying, yeah, that's actually going to work. And in radiology and ophthalmology, by now, I think we all sort of know that the machine learning models are actually better than human beings at actually detecting small cell lung cancer, retinal macular degeneration in the case of eyes, and so forth, right? So the nature of that work is going to change pretty dramatically. It's not going to go away. It's just going to be really different. So you want to think seriously about whether you want to be in those particular professions. Do you want to be in law? And the answer is yes, because AI is not going to change a thing, okay? That is to say, AI systems or machine learning models will be used in law. They're already being used in law. They're being typically rolled out into the big commercial arenas, right? So you see it in electronic discovery, where the models will be able to pull out relevant documents much better than human beings, but that market's already gone. Humans are not in that market. Same with due diligence in mergers and acquisitions. Don't worry about that. And they're being used as useful tools in things like document drafting, right? So you know, one of the startups that I'm kind of looking at the moment is that we're looking to build a document drafting system, a little bit like I don't know if you've seen GitHub's Copilot, maybe not, but it's basically a way of programming that relies upon GPT-3, which is one of these large language models that actually can predict what would be the next thing that you want to say here in relation to, in their case, computer programming, in our case, a legal document, right? So it will actually help you, right? It's this bionic process of a human together with the computer system actually generating better outcomes than the human or the computer can do themselves. We've seen this done a lot, you know, years ago. Sometimes, anyone here play chess? It's called centaur chess, where a computer together with a human being is better than either the computer or the human being alone, and that's now the sort of the future. So that will be the future of law, right? The reality is that although machine learning models will actually be interesting and useful, and I will be teaching hopefully a number of you about this in the years to come, the reality is it's not going to change the legal profession very much, and it's not going to change legal practice. I say that it's serious for law schools and intractable we have to start teaching these sorts of things in law schools because that's the environment that people are going to go out and practice within. I say it's intractable because there are very few people that actually want to teach this stuff, right, or care enough about it to learn, or like me, just happen to be a geek and want to do it anyway. So it's really, really hard to actually make this work in most places. But what it means is that I need to spend less time, running the law school and more time teaching this stuff. But you need to talk to my boss about that. So what are the conclusions around this? Conclusions are, as in the first two, right? Future law doesn't look like the past, and it's not really about the tech, right? There are three things that I said at the beginning, or the three sort of large-scale global changes that are important. So one is commodification. It's going to change the profession a lot, or the practice of law a lot. Two, the stuff around virtualization, already changing it. And three, the stuff around platforms and the death of the law firm. Those are going to change it. AI, not so much. So why do I say then the future of law doesn't need the legal profession? Why is this called the future of law and brackets the death of the legal profession? So the thing that worries me, it doesn't keep me up at night, but I think we really need to think quite a lot about, is how those macro changes affect the delivery of law by the profession. The reason I did the strike through, that scared strike through at the beginning around the legal profession and around legal practice, is that all of those three things that are really going to change law affect the legal profession as a learned profession that has its own internal ethics that ensures the propagation of culture as well as the delivery of legal services by learned professionals who have an ethic of care towards that. What you find in a lot of, take FTX and the blockchain example. That's a very particular example of lots and lots of money being given to unethical people, and I'm shocked that it turned out badly, okay? Who would have thought that giving billions of dollars or billions of pounds to a 30-year-old who dresses in shorts and who looks like he knows what he's doing, but actually was just completely a liar, right? That turned out badly. I'm amazed, okay? So that sort of process can and is happening within these three large-scale changes that I already talked about. They're not, these companies are not run by lawyers, right? The commodification of these things is not necessarily created by people who are as nice and as ethical as me. Settle Easy, that conveyancing firm, happens to be one that I created, but equally it could have been created by somebody as unethical and as unprincipled as Michael Shilley, for example, there in the second back row. You should have a chat to him. But there's not the same sort of idea that we have at the moment, where we've got a highly regulated profession where everybody's a serious member of that profession, and that culturally they believe in that. They see themselves as primarily lawyers, and so they honestly really couldn't even imagine doing an SPF type of rug pull as he did with FTX. So that's one concern. The other concern is if you think about things like freelancing as the way in which lots and lots of junior lawyers are going to ply their trade, they're not going to be trained as well, right? Because there's no money for it. They're not going to be inculcated into that particular culture. They are going to have to find their own way, both in terms of training as well as becoming a member of the set called lawyers. We haven't thought about that at all, and it's happening, and it's sort of happening without us having any input in that. I often come across as a technological evangelist, which I kind of am, but I really worry about these sorts of changes that are macro changes that are happening very quickly that we haven't really given a lot of thought to. And so that's why I don't actually think it will be the death of the legal profession, but it sure is a change in the status quo. It's very different from the environment that I graduated into. And the future of law for many of the young students that we have here and some of the young grads and others is quite a different one, and one that I hope that we can help with here at King's, but I do think is an open question. And that is the end of everything I wanted to say. I'm happy, of course, to take questions, but we can also do that while having a drink. Yes, down here, there's a mic coming around. I might just get you to wait until that, and while I open up some water.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the lecture. Two, I want to thank King's and your department for the invitation. I'm not a lawyer, What I've got to ask you, the question I'll ask is the substance of what we are, very big. I made a few notes as you went along. With special reference to nationwide proportionality, the powers that be and the mafia fear justice. Why? Can you associate your answer with enhancing each category of lawyers that you mentioned in the presentation? Thank you.
I thank you for the question. I'm not sure it's one that is generally applicable, but I'd love to catch up with you at the break. But it's not one that I think is one that I'm able to answer within this public forum.
Hi, Professor Dan. Jason here, LLM student at King's. You mentioned that with ALSPs and work being outsourced to developing countries, and also with legal ops, it's going to affect students' employment potentially. So this is going to have a ripple effect. The ripple effect is on the law schools, because law schools bank on the fact that X amount of students would join the university. So this will lead to a phenomenon that you mentioned, the death of the law school. So bearing that in mind, what are law schools undertaking to cover this risk, or perhaps even what King's is doing on this regard? Thank you.
So it's a great question. Let me make a general observation, then we can talk about King's. So the general observation is that I don't think most law schools are really aware of this, right? So the people who become deans of law schools generally are not chosen because they're interested in these sorts of questions. I don't think I was chosen necessarily because I'm interested in this sort of question. And what you find is that law schools and universities generally very slow-moving, very conservative institutions, and have been able to rely upon pretty sort of standard types of models for how you bring students in, and certain expectations around how many students are going to turn up, which means this is how much money we can bank on, and this is how many academics we can hire, and blah blah blah, right? So it's a pretty static type of environment. You have to have done what I've done to, and I'm sorry, that comes out as really, it's all about me. So the reason that I am the way that I am is because I started a law school that didn't need to exist. So I was in an environment where I was absolutely paranoid, and I had to make the case of this is the reason why you come here, right? And when I talked to deans of other law schools, they would look at me like I was nuts, right? I would say, well, do you have any idea about these changes? I talk about ALSPs, and they'd look at me like, what is that, right? So it just wasn't something that they cared about. I think that what you will find, a little bit like the difference between big law firms and small law firms, is that the incumbent providers of law school training, like King's, have got great brands. And so people will continue to come here, even with all of these changes, even if we do nothing, right? Because they can go out and get jobs in those big law firms that aren't really affected too much by this, or they go to the bar, which isn't really affected too much by this. What I'd like to do is to have a conversation within King's with all of my faculty around, well, do you really think that this is true? Some of my faculty members are here today, and they may disagree vehemently with what I'm saying. But we should have a discussion around that and say, well, how might we make our degrees more valuable and ensure that this takes place? What you'll see is that there will be various providers, other law schools, that will start to get this idea that will be probably at the lower end of the market, and they will often be in low-cost countries where you can do labor market arbitrage, right? So you see this in some really quite forward-thinking Indian law schools. I've had a chat with some South African deans. They're sort of getting it. They see that there are jobs in this particular area for their grads, so they're actually starting to provision for that. So as the large-scale changes happen within the legal service delivery, you'll see a little bit of movement in law schools. The thing is that you probably won't see it at law schools like King's, unless you happen to have a dean who's really interested in this topic and convince his faculty of that. So what am I doing around this over the course of, I've been in the job for nearly 4 months. Engaged in a process of trying to think about what should be in the degrees that we offer in order to make sure that you have the best possible outcomes in this, which is why I'm going to be teaching legal tech and AI, and why we're going to be changing a few things over time, not all at once. But hope that answers the question.
Hi, Dan. I'm a tech entrepreneur, not a lawyer. So first of all, thank you for making this presentation very understandable.
Let's chat later. I really I'm looking for another startup. Yeah, go.
Yeah. I really like this view of the ways of disruption, AI, virtualization, and the impact to the different actors in the law domain. I would be also interested in your view of how these ways of disruption and their impact, do you think, on the subdomains of law? I mean, as an outsider, I'm a bit challenged to understand, for instance, corporate law, family law, criminal, employment law, or to make it very tangible, the question, if you're an investor and there are great ideas,
yeah,
is there a subdomain you would like to go and subdomains you would avoid?
Absolutely, but you'd have to pay me a lot of money to tell you exactly which ones. So it's not that complicated, right? So what you do is you pick every area or any area, and you say, what are the structural reasons why that won't change, and what are the ways in which that it might change? So when I first moved over here, I thought an obvious area that I should spin something up in is in conveyancing, because the conveyancing market here is just broken. Like, it's completely just a mess. And I've got a whole platform, and we've built a company in Australia. We could just pick that up and dump it down here, and we're off to the races. And as soon as I started looking at the nature of the market here, there are just lots of structural reasons why it's just really, really hard to do anything interesting, unless you decide you want to have a 10-year project in utterly transforming conveyancing here and the property law system here. And I just don't want to do that. I just, 10 years is just too long to, I've banged my head against that thing for, many years. We've pretty much cracked it. And now it's like, yeah, let me go and do something interesting, which will be in regulation and compliance, which is where there's a lot of money. And we can talk about that later. So basically you just look at each area and go, are there structural reasons? Yes, no, are there ways in which we can use technology to do this? Are there, mechanisms that we can bypass lawyers, or we can work with lawyers, or whatever it might be? Let's sit down and have a chat about each of those different ones, and I can give you some sort of guidance. But there's lots of disruption that's happening. There are lots of people who've tried and failed. One of the things that's really interesting here in the UK is that it seems like every single legal technology provider who's not selling to law firms sort of thinks that the best way of handling or fixing and disrupting the law market, or the legal service delivery market, is to create a marketplace, joining lawyers to clients. For God's sake, don't do that. That's just a terrible idea. It doesn't work. There are so many failures, and it's just an awful idea. But as I say, we can talk about different things at the break. Dude, I'm going to be supervising your PhD, your LLM dissertation. We could talk about it then. No, go on. Ask the question. Hello. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for the talk. How do you see regulation coming before AI? I mean, there are projects for regulating AI here in the UK, in the EU, China, the USA. And of course, lawyers are going to be the main affected with, traditional lawyers are going to be the main affected, and always those who are affected obviously raise their hands. And we have regulation upcoming. So how do you see the role of regulation before these innovations in AI?
Yeah, so I've been talking just about the way in which these technological changes or economic changes affect the legal profession. What you're talking about there is what I would sort of characterize as sort of traditional lawyering, right? A new law is made, lawyers have to sort of look at how we implement that, how we fix it, how we ensure that our clients are okay. And that's great. It's a really important question. It's just not one that really affects the whole of the profession, right? What you're seeing, like people like you, we will teach you enough about machine learning models and mechanisms of training and the three different, basic architectural types, so that you can actually go and talk to your clients and actually see whether or not the regulation is going to affect them and affect the policy and all that sort of stuff. So so that's the sort of there is a relatively small market opportunity for lawyers to do this kind of thing. They will work as lawyers advising companies that are building machine learning models, and that'll be great. Or they might be working in lobbying, dealing with Parliament or the EU or whoever to sort of try to push this towards a certain direction. Again, really valuable, but that's that's like saying, oh, I'm going to become an IP lawyer, or I'm going to become an M&A lawyer. In this case, you become an AI/ML lawyer, and that's an interesting sort of sub-discipline to go into. So it's sort of off to one side, but it's a growth area. My views about the ability of governments to actually regulate at the granular level that's necessary to ensure protection, I've got some doubts about that, but that's a different talk. I'm giving some of that tomorrow at a different conference. Anything else, or should we have a drink? Yes, at least one more.
So I was a part of city firms, highly agree. They've done the virtualization, outsourcing to groups of paralegals. And I think there is a huge risk for graduates, law schools, what the job opportunities are. And I think there's a huge risk that you get to go to work for one of the platforms, you end up being provided as a service, and you end up very narrow for expertise.
Yep, absolutely.
Huge expertise in a data protection. Huge expertise in how do you think students or law firms, law can help graduates from getting
Yeah.
career? Do you have any? I tell you, we've been going down that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Look, it's a fabulous observation. I'm glad that there's a little bit of validation of what I've seen, that inside it, that you've seen the same sort of thing. And then as to your particular question, I think it operates a little bit differently depending on where you're sitting within the firm. From the perspective of the partners, they're very comfortable with specialization, because the more specialized you are, you're the widget that you sit in that, and then you're making lots of money, which is great. That's not necessarily the interest of the graduate or the lawyer, and we don't do, as law schools, a good job of explaining to the law students and the new grads and our alums the nature of the work that they're going to do and how they can manage their career. So the class I'll be teaching sort of legal tech and AI over the course of the next few years. But the one I really want to teach is the business of law, right? Which is, how are these businesses structured? How can you operate as a lawyer within that? As a law student going out and doing that. What are the differences between, if you're operating at a partnership of a certain sort, or you're operating at a publicly listed company? How do you actually take control over your career to ensure that you're not so specialized that when there's a slight downturn, you get pushed and so on? So there's a lot that we can do. We just have to grab the nettle and actually say we're going to do that. Now, whether we do that within an LLM or even an LLB, or whether we do that as a sort of a lifelong learning kind of exercise, or something that we work on with our alums, which we're really working on much harder now, is an open question. I think there are lots of ways of doing it, but I think it's a great observation, because the nature of the profession is changing, which means the nature of your career within that profession is going to change, and it's not going to suit everybody.